A Mac Mini with M2 or M2 Pro? That's a pretty enticing proposition. And with the M2 Mini starting at just $599 or £649 here in the UK, it represents fantastic value. Is there anything else at this price point offering this much computing performance? But is the entry-level model the one you should buy? Does it still make a good value proposition once you start speccing it up? And should you go for the standard M2 Mini or the M2 Pro? Let's discuss. Apple's M2 chip is a decent step up over M1. It offers around 11% better single-core performance and 17% better multi-core performance. And that's not to be sniffed at, considering how good the M1 was, and still is. But the biggest improvement came in GPU performance, which improved by 46%. Memory bandwidth also increased over M1 by 50%, and now you can spec up to 24 gigabytes of RAM. And if you work with ProRes video footage, you'll appreciate the ProRes encoder and decoder that's embedded into the M2 chip. Despite these solid improvements, some tech outlets have expressed disappointment in M2's performance. But perhaps could this be because they paid too much attention to the rumour mill and the idea that Apple would be moving to a 3nm fabrication process with M2? Now, of course, if they could have done that, that would have allowed for even greater leaps. But with the global supply chain constraints, Apple took the more traditional route of increasing clock speed and adding cores. And presumably the M3 range, when it comes out, will be built on this new fabrication process, and that is an exciting prospect to consider. Some folks may want to wait for that, but of course, if you're one of those who always likes to wait for the next best thing, well, you'll always be waiting, because in tech there's always something better down the line. And what if you already have one of the M1 base machines? Is M2 enough of a good upgrade to make it worth the expense? I don't think so, outside of a few exceptions. But that doesn't really apply to the Mac Mini as a device, because now we have the option of an M2 Pro Mac Mini, and that's going to appeal to some users. So let's now talk specifically about the Mini. Both the M2 and the M2 Pro are using the same chassis, and they have mostly the same I/O. And not much has changed from the M1 Mini. But the key difference is that the M2 Pro has 4 Thunderbolt ports, whereas the M2 has just 2. But you'll notice that these are now fully compliant with Thunderbolt 4. Previously, the standard M1 and M2 chips have had a USB 4 port incorporating Thunderbolt 3. But the main difference has been the lack of support for external displays. With the M1 Mini, you could drive 2 displays, but only one of them could be connected to Thunderbolt. The other had to use the HDMI port. Now, the M2 Mini still only supports 2 displays, but you can drive them both via Thunderbolt, or one by Thunderbolt and one by HDMI. Like the M1 Mini, you can connect one of Apple's Pro XDR 6K displays, and then the second display can be up to 5K on Thunderbolt. If you're using HDMI, you're limited to 4K at 60 Hz. And here's the other main difference between the M2 and the M2 Pro Mini. With the M2 Pro, you get the newer HDMI port, and that supports 8K at up to 60 Hz or 4K at up to 240 Hz. And the M2 Pro model allows you to connect 3 displays, but there are limitations here. Try and keep up with this. You can have 2 at 6K running over Thunderbolt and then have a 4K 60 Hz display on HDMI. Or you can run one 6K display on Thunderbolt and drive a 4K display at 144 Hz via HDMI. But if you want to use an 8K display or make use of 4K at 240 Hz with that new HDMI port, then you will be limited to that single display. For the rest of the I/O, you've got 2 USB Type-A ports, which frustratingly are still 5 gigabit per second ports. Why, Apple? There's a 3.5mm headphone jack and a gigabit Ethernet port, which you can upgrade to a 10 gigabit Ethernet port on either model. And that's great news if you rely on fast network access to storage devices. There's a couple of minor improvements over the M1 Mac Mini. We've gone from Bluetooth 5 to 5.3 and from Wi-Fi 6 to 6E. So let's hope that the Bluetooth dropouts that some of the M1 Mini users experienced are a thing of the past. So let's now talk about the options, because there are actually 3 different chips available. You've got the standard M2, but then there are 2 versions of the M2 Pro. And we'll look at each of these and the pricing in a moment. But first, let's ask the question, should you go standard M2 or should you go for one of these M2 Pro options? What you need to know is that M2 Pro will deliver broadly similar single-core performance to M2, but multi-core performance is massively improved, up to 72%. The memory bandwidth is doubled, which may make a difference in graphics applications, and you can spec up to 32 gigabytes of RAM. The graphics performance itself is also up to 72% improved over the standard M2. Notice the use of up to there. This is the performance you can expect with the full fat version of the M2 Pro. The bin chip is going to be slightly less than that. And I should say at this point that I'm basing these percentage figures on benchmark figures that have been published. In the real world, you might find a larger performance gap or a smaller performance gap, depending on the application you're using. The base M2 Pro chip is what's called a binned chip, so it perhaps didn't perform up to spec, so what they've done is switched off 2 of the CPU cores and 3 of the GPU cores. There's nothing wrong with that, all of the CPU manufacturers do it. Now the big advantage of M2 Pro overall is going to be the multi-core performance and the graphics performance. So if you're a keen Apple gamer, you're going to benefit from M2 Pro. And if you're working in a creative field like professional video or music production, the M2 Pro is a good shout. But that's not to say that you can't do any of those things with the standard M2 either. And for the majority of users, M2 does offer enough performance. Let's take a look now at specs and prices, because this is always the biggest minefield when it comes to speccing up Apple products. Yes, you can get an M2 Mac Mini for $599 or £649, or even less if you're eligible for educational discounts. And that does represent phenomenal value and a great entry point into the world of Mac OS. But it's 2023, and the base configuration still comes with 8GB of RAM. This wasn't really enough for the M1 chips. We found that they were hitting the SSD very hard to swap memory. Now it does seem that the SSDs are more than capable of handling this behavior. However, in our tests, what we found is that upgrading your M1 Mac to 16GB over 8GB was a very worthwhile upgrade. The reason why it's such a good upgrade is because the memory on these systems is known as unified memory, and it is accessible equally to the entire system on chip. So that includes all of those CPU cores and the GPU cores, and that's significant. In an x86 machine, a PC with onboard graphics, traditionally some of the system RAM is reserved for the GPU, but M1 and M2 doesn't work that way. The graphics cores can access all of the available RAM and even address the same spaces that the CPU is using to eliminate copying of data between the CPU and the GPU. An upgrade from 8GB to 16GB might be seen as just doubling the RAM, but in real-world use, it could actually more than double the RAM that is available to the graphics cores or to the CPU cores. And that will have an effect in GPU-heavy applications like photo and video editing or gaming. And now remember that the M2 has more graphics cores than M1. They're running at a higher clock frequency and it's offering that 46% performance gain. But the entry M2 model still has 8GB of RAM. So more than ever, we'd say that if you really want to use all the performance of the M2, you're going to want that RAM upgrade. And that pushes the price up to $799 or £849. We also take issue with the default SSD capacity. Again, here we are in 2023 and Apple is still offering a base configuration of 256GB. And for many people, that's just not enough. Now true, you can easily add fast storage via the Thunderbolt ports, but speed of the internal drive is also a factor. On the M2 MacBook Air, the 256GB model has one NAND flash chip, whereas the higher capacities have 2 chips. And with 2 chips, you can access the storage in parallel, and that increases the speed of the SSD quite considerably. Now, if Apple does the same thing with the M2 Mac Mini, which is probably quite likely, then it means that that base storage configuration will be slower than the 256GB storage in the M1 Mini, because that had 2 chips. Now, even if you use external storage or network storage, you're going to want to have some working space on your main storage drive. My average YouTube video takes up 100GB. If you're a keen Logic Pro user, you'll know that the standard sound libraries, they're pretty hefty. Again, if you're likely to push your Mac Mini with pro creative workflows or gaming, you're probably going to want to upgrade that storage to at least 512GB. And that takes our price up to $999 or £1,049. Arguably, that's still a good deal considering the performance that's on offer, but we've raised the price from the base model by 67% to add in that additional RAM and storage. And another key upgrade that you might want to consider is the 10GB Ethernet port. Network speeds are increasing, and if you need to access a NAS system, you'll probably want that faster port. So if you add that, and then maybe spec up a more sensible 1TB of storage, we're now up to $1,299 or £1,349. And that price is the crossover point to the M2 Pro Mini. Before we get to that, you might wonder whether you should go for 24GB of RAM on the M2 Mini. And it's difficult to answer that at the time of recording because we haven't done any detailed testing yet. But if the lessons that we learned from the M1 range still apply, then the answer is probably not. We noticed that in most real-world tasks, the increase from 16 gigs to 32 gigs on the M1 Pro didn't make that much difference. So at this point, I'd only select 24 gigs if you know you're going to be running very memory-intensive tasks. So that brings us to the M2 Pro model, which starts at $1,299 or £1,399. And for that, you're already getting a more respectable 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gig SSD. But don't forget, you also have that improved external display support. You've got a better HDMI port and 2 additional Thunderbolt ports. This model does have that cut-down binned chip, so it has fewer CPU cores, but it will still offer a significant boost over the standard M2 when it comes to multi-core performance. The same thing was done with the M1 Pro chips, and if you got the binned M1 Pro chip, you lost about 20% compared to the full version of the same chip. If we've got the same difference here, then it means the binned version of M2 Pro will still offer close to 40% uplift on the standard M2 when it comes to multi-core performance. Now, this bin chip also has 3 fewer GPU cores, but it still has 6 more cores than the standard M2, so that's going to represent a significant uplift in graphics performance, particularly when you remember that memory bandwidth on this chip is doubled compared to the M2. And whilst this model is $300 or £350 more expensive than an M2 Mini with the same RAM and storage, you are getting much faster multi-core performance. You're getting faster graphics, better display support, and 2 additional Thunderbolt ports. So when you consider the price of the other upgrades that we've looked at, this particular uplift looks like a bit of a no-brainer, and that means that this particular model, perhaps with the optional 10 gigabit Ethernet, has to be our pick of the range for the best bang for your buck. But as we start to upgrade from this point, things become less clear. Suppose we add that better M2 Pro chip, we push the memory up to 32 gigs and add the 10 gigabit Ethernet. We're now looking at $2,099 or £2,199. And this gives us a problem in our decision-making process because of the Mac Studio, which is cheaper. At its basically $2,000 or £2,000 entry price, the Mac Studio gives you an M1 Max, 32 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, and a 10 gigabit Ethernet port as standard. But you also get 2 additional 10 gigabit USB-C ports and an SDXC card reader. The 3.5mm headphone jack has support for high-impedance headphones, which may be important for audio or video professionals, and the chassis is bigger with better thermals. But how does that M1 Max chip compare to M2 Pro? On single-core performance, the M1 Max is slower than all of the M2 chips, but that is a bit like saying that one supercar is slower than another supercar. Outside of benchmarks, you're not likely to notice a difference. The M2 Pro, though, does offer more multi-core performance, about 22% more, and that is a decent uplift. Although even here, the M1 Max is fast enough that you might not notice that difference in your real-world application. M1 Max has double the memory bandwidth of M2 Pro, and it offers about 23% more graphics performance. It supports 4 6K displays via its Thunderbolt ports, and you can add a 5th 4K display at 60Hz via HDMI. So if you work with video, you'll appreciate that, and you'll appreciate the fact that the M1 Max has 1 additional encode engine for H.264 and HEVC, and it has an additional ProRes encode and decode engine. So if you work with these codecs, you'll probably see much improved video editing performance. And basically, if your use is GPU dependent, then you may be better off with the M1 Max Mac Studio. Overall though, the M2 Mac Mini is a very welcome upgrade. As always with Apple products, you just need to choose carefully. Which model would you go for? Are you excited by the M2 Mini, or are you going to hold off and see what M3 might bring? Let us know in the comments, and as always, thank you for your subs, your shares and your likes, even your dislikes. See you soon for some more geekery.